following is a work of fiction and should not be taken as actual history.
Meet Professor Roger Hill, historian, adventurer, and raconteur extraordinaire. He travels to parallel worlds where history went differently and brings back lectures on his findings. So grab a prime seat, pay attention, and take good notes. This is Alternate History 100. Welcome to the class.
Good morning. We live in a pretty tense world. The Russians have been in Ukraine for almost 3 years, the Middle East is a mess as always, and the Chinese have built the biggest navy in the world. What do you need all those ships for, Mr. Xi? Doesn't your bathtub have enough boats already? Well, we know what they're for. Anybody who has read Alfred Thayer Mahan knows that navies are all about projecting power beyond your borders. And we hear a lot about the South China Sea, but Beijing isn't just interested in a few fly-speck islands where there might be some oil. They're looking at one big, well-populated island that they wrongly believe is theirs. And the day will probably come when they try to take it, and we will have to decide if we're going to let that happen. And if you think that that island isn't important enough to fight for, well, I want you to think about where the semiconductors in that laptop you're typing on came from. But what if that day never came? What if we lived in a world where China was a friend and not a potential enemy? Well, I visited such a world, and it's quite different from the one we live in. Let's begin by reviewing Chinese history as it was in both our world and the one that I visited. For centuries, China was ruled by an emperor. Then, in 1911, a republican government came to power. There were years of struggle as that government fought with local warlords. And as soon as that fire was brought under control, up popped the communists, demanding their turn at the buffet. And in the midst of that mess, Japan stepped into the picture. They needed the iron and coal mines of Manchuria for their steel industry, and they thought that China was too divided and weak to stop them from taking them. So they attacked China, took Manchuria, and set up a puppet regime called Manchukuo. It wasn't a country that anybody actually recognized, but they did have stamps and money and everything like that. And even with that Japanese invasion happening, the Chinese factions still kept fighting each other. And it didn't stop until Manchurian troops kidnapped President Chiang Kai-shek and forced him to end the civil war and form a united front against the Japanese. And even then, the alliance was a reluctant one, with each side trying to consolidate its own position at the expense of the other. The Japanese grabbed more territory as the years went by, and were not ousted until their defeat by Allied forces in 1945. And as soon as that happened, things started to heat up again between the rival factions. They were like two kids wrestling in the back seat with no parent to say, "If you don't behave, we're going to turn this car around." In 1946, the United States sent General George C. Marshall to try to broker an agreement between the sides. But neither of them would agree to terms, and full-scale war broke out once more. The nationalists had some initial successes, but the communists survived the early setbacks and roared back to win the war and drive the nationalists to Taiwan. But that's our world. In the other world that I visited, things went quite differently. Zhou Enlai was killed in combat in 1946, and the following year, U.S. intelligence located Mao Zedong and gave his location to the nationalists so they could get him too. It's the same way they took out Che Guevara in our world. Yeah, I know some of you like him. I see that t-shirt there. Oh, wait a minute, that's not Che Guevara. It's Sheldon Guevara. It says Bazinga. Give your friend a hand for his fashion sense. Without these leaders, Mao and Zhou, the communist forces fell into disarray. They did not roar back from their initial setbacks. They were defeated. The nationalist forces were not driven to Taiwan. They remained in power in Peking. Yeah, I see your hands. That's what they called it then. And that name is still around. You don't go into a restaurant and order Beijing duck. And if you did, they'd look at you the same way they'd look if you drank your finger bowl. Don't tell me you've never seen anyone do that. There were still communist guerrillas in the countryside, but the Reds never ran the nation. The government remained friendly to the West. And hang on to your egg rolls, because that made a lot of difference. Let's start with the Korean War. In our world, North Korea attacked South Korea in June of 1950. They had huge initial success, pushing the South all the way back to the southern tip of the peninsula. And then the UN troops came in and pushed the North all the way back to the Chinese border. And then Communist China sent in 300,000 soldiers and pushed back the UN troops. And after 3 years of fighting, they signed a truce that left things pretty much as they were before the war began. In that world, there was no interference from China. When the UN troops pushed the North back to the Chinese border, the war came to an end with the complete and total defeat of the communists before 1950 was over. The short duration of the war meant that there was no book called MASH by Richard Hooker, and no movie based on that book, and no TV series either. Maybe somebody can write about what that meant to pop culture in the 1970s of that world. Within China itself, there was no great leap forward and no cultural revolution. That meant that millions of people who were killed in our world lived on. There was no forced conformity. There was no little red book. John Lennon never wrote a line about carrying pictures of Chairman Mao. And honestly, I don't know why he even did that here. Did any boomer actually think he could make it with a girl by carrying a picture of some chubby foreign dictator? Hey baby, check this out. Don't I look good next to him? The absence of a communist government meant there was no trade embargo. That China was like the Japan of our world. They began by making cheap toys and electronics, and then moved on to bigger and better things. In that world's 21st century, Chinese cars are exported all over the world. Unlike here, where China exports things like mops that break the first time you use them. Yeah, I know, I've used that joke before. In that world's 1960s, when things heated up in Southeast Asia, U.S. forces made a full-scale invasion of North Vietnam. They had no fear that China would come over the border, as they most certainly feared in our world. This meant that their Vietnam War was not a war of containment fought to maintain the status quo. No, it was a war to bring down a communist government. And as happened in their Korea, their Vietnam was reunited under the banner of the South, and the conflict was wrapped up in months. And what do you think that meant? Well, let's look at our world. Our America was torn apart by the Vietnam War. But over there, the quick victory was celebrated. There were no protests, no draft dodgers, and a whole lot of anti-war songs never even got written. And there was one more side effect of that quick victory. In our world, the 26th Amendment, giving 18-year-olds the right to vote, came about as a direct result of that protracted war. In that world, sorry to tell you, your counterparts don't have that right. The voting age there is still 21. In our world, the economy boomed in the 1960s. Over there, the quick end to the war in Vietnam meant there wasn't a draft, and that meant higher unemployment among the youth. Our bad economy of the 70s came to them just a little bit sooner. In our world, the 1975 fall of South Vietnam emboldened communist movements around the world. They came to power in Nicaragua and Angola and Mozambique and Laos and Cambodia. In North Korea, Mr. Kim was spoiling for a rematch with the South. The West was absolutely losing the Cold War in the late 1970s. But over there, none of these things happened. Oh, the Soviets and Cubans continued to back insurgents, but that is as far as it went. none of them ever came to power. I think you can see that the absence of a communist government in China resulted in a better world than the one we live in. So where does that leave us? Mr. Celsius would not be happy because it shows that a communist victory in the Chinese Civil War was not inevitable. But is anyone uneasy because it puts up Mao Zedong as proof of the great man theory? Yeah, me too. He was a brutal dictator who killed more people than Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin combined. But maybe what we need to do is crowbar the words great and good apart from one another. I don't think anybody would say he was a good man, but his impact on history is undeniable. And on that fact alone, I suppose he was great. Even if I think that the world where he died in 1947 is much better than the one we live in. Your assignment is to write a 2,000-word essay on that other world. Here are some suggested topics. What were the 1950s like in a world where the Korean War ended in 6 months? What effect did that have on the 1952 election? Or how about their very short Vietnam War? What were the 1960s like without all the turmoil that war brought to our world? How about the effect of not having communism in East Asia? Or having another major player on the stage of world trade that much sooner? As always, you can write about politics, the military, the economy, pop culture, or anything else that strikes your fancy. I've brought back lots of material for your research, but no, I can't help you move there, even if you think it is way better than our world. Even here, you don't get a vote on that. Class dismissed. Hi, I'm Gary Wheeler. Alternate History 100 is a labor of love with the twin goals of entertaining you and making you think. If you like what you heard today, please hit the subscribe button, give us a like, and tell your friends about us. Your word of mouth can really help this channel grow. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. Until then, keep thinking and make some history of your own.
The preceding was a work of fiction and should not be taken as actual history.